Let's talk about another intervention for evidence-based change management. This one is called re-anchoring, and it's aimed at resource allocation. And what we often see in change management is that the change managers are onboarded quite late, and the resources allocated to them and their project are often subpar. And today we're going to look at a behavioral perspective on how to allocate resources from a managerial and leadership perspective in a very objective and unbiased way with the re-anchoring technique. So we have to start first at why would we do re-anchoring in the first place? Well, what we notice in budget allocation decisions and resource allocation is that the anchoring bias is particularly persistent. Now, we know the anchoring bias because it is our tendency to focus and to heavily weigh the first piece of information that is in our minds when we make a decision. And when we look at the data from budgeting decisions in, for example, Fortune 500 companies, we see that this year's budgeting decision always looks very, very, very similar to last year's budgeting decision. And there's a reason for that. It is the anchoring bias. Last year's budget anchors the minds of the decision makers, but that might not be very factual or very objective, because in this year, of course, circumstances might be radically different. What do we get? We get a skewed resource allocation and, more importantly, underfunded critical change initiatives and projects. So we're going to look at an intervention that counters this effect, and we're going to do it because it's a bit of a complicated one to explain in a short video. We're going to do it with a case, with a fictitious company, GreenTech, and they are going to decide on bring their business into a new solar panel technology project. And they want to make sure that the allocation goes well and it's not underfunded, because that could be the status quo. Now, let's talk about re-anchoring, the remedy, if you will, for the anchoring bias in budget decisions. This has been invented or created by Dan Lovallo and Olivier Sibony, two famous figures in the behavioral science world, who we admire very much at Neurofied as well. And they used it to combat biases in budget allocation. What it means is they purposefully create a second anchor that is based purely on objective facts and data, which will counter the initial anchor that is in our minds due to the anchoring bias, which is probably based on, last year's budget or how we usually budget projects like these. So the purpose of re-anchoring is by introducing this second fact-based anchor to guide decision makers to make a more objective decision about how to allocate resources, in this case, GreenTech's case, to this particular change project. Now, let's follow the steps of how you would apply re-anchoring to make sure that you make objective decisions about budget. First, you would want the decision makers to be aware of anchoring in the first place, if they're not yet. So in the case of GreenTech, it would be great to hold a meeting, introduce the concept of anchoring bias and how it could possibly affect our budgeting decisions. Then we want to gather as much relevant information that we can to create that second anchor. And this is usually where you would want to involve business analysts or data analysts that are not immediately involved in the final decision, but that can help you create that fact-based anchor. So you would want to send them out, and in the case of GreenTech, you would want them to research solar panel projects. How much do these usually cost in terms of budget for change management, for all the technical stuff, and make the search broad, go look at what competitors are doing, look at what other industries that might have similar projects are doing, make the data set as broad and factual as possible. Then this data is brought to the decision makers in the form of a second anchor. So, of course, it's not about saying we did all this research about this fact-based anchor, and now that's what you have to use for your decision. No, instead, you bring this fact-based anchor and you introduce it as, when you purely look at the data, the rough, uncontextual data, this is what these types of projects usually cost. And you would like them to weigh that against their first anchor. So it's presented to the decision makers. Now you will want them to compare these two anchors. And this is usually where things get a lot of fun, sometimes in terms of the decision makers, a bit frustrating, because when you have this purely fact-based anchor, what we see 9 out of 10 times is that it's very, very different from the initial anchor that was in the minds of the decision makers, based on past projects, based on historical facts. And you would want to make that very explicit. Make it explicit that there's a big disparity in resource allocation between what they thought would be a good amount of resources and what the fact-based data shows to be a good amount of resources. This puts their attention to the extent that anchoring bias can influence your decision making. And of course, it rouses a lot of interesting discussions. So of course, this doesn't mean that you have to make the decision right away. Instead, this is where you want to dedicate a good amount of time on rediscussing what a good amount, or at least like a decent and fact-based amount of resources would be in this particular project. So here it's okay to bring in, again, some intuition, to bring the context of the decision makers and the context of the company, but at least now you're operating between these two anchors and not solely basing your decision on one anchor that might be historical or might be non-factual. So here the GreenTech leaders rediscuss. And then the last step is to adjust your decision. You want to correct for the anchoring bias after you had this discussion based on the data that was presented to you. And here you will mainly see that the final answer is somewhere between the first and the second anchor. It doesn't have to be, of course, a mirror of the pure factual data, but at least you can correct the way in which you are making that decision in the first place. So this is where GreenTech revisits it. And what we see is that in this way, you can make allocation decisions a lot more objective and a lot more fact-based. You can reduce and mitigate anchoring bias in that decision-making process. And of course, you can go far beyond this GreenTech case and look at other ways, in other allocations in your company. The allocation of time, for example, the allocation of FTEs, allocation of freelancers, whatever it is. Be aware of the fact that anchoring bias might be in the mind of the decision makers, and be aware that you can create a second anchor to make the decision more objective and to make it more fact-based. I would say experiment with this, bring it to your decision, see what it does for you, and yeah, in that same way, keep experimenting. See you next time.